Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Linehan, president of the City Club. I want to particularly thank all of you who slogged through snow and sleet and ice and storm to make it to City Club. You're really our City Club faithful and true public policy addicts. I applaud you. And I wish we could get a photo of everybody's footwear today. I don't think City Club has ever seen it quite like this before. Today, we have the 5th installment of City Club's series on Keeping Oregon's Promise. Our topic today is financing public services. Our panelists are Senator Kate Brown and Mike Burton, who's Vice Provost of Portland State University. Representative Max Williams, who was going to be here, is very apologetic that he was unable to keep his commitment to participate in today's seminar or panel. His recent appointment as Director of the Department of Corrections, which began January 1st of this year, threw him into a whirlwind of pre-scheduled appointments, and that schedule was exacerbated, of course, by our recent weather. Although he wishes he could be here, he was unable to move the scheduled appointments he had today with institution superintendents and labor union leadership, and he sends his apologies and his support for Oregon maintaining strong public services. So, before we begin our program, I have a few items of City Club business, and since you're all the City Club faithful, I'm sure you'll be very interested in these. On Monday, January 12th, City Club hosts a special forum examining the issues surrounding ballot measure 30. Jim Westwood will moderate a panel that includes Senator Peter Courtney, Representative Jeff Kropf, Health and Human Service lobbyist Ellen Lowe, and J.L. Wilson, who's State Director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses. The forum will be free and open to the public, and it'll be held at the Commissioner's Boardroom at the Multnomah County Building, which is at 501 Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard at the east end of the Hawthorne Bridge. That will be from 5 to 6:30 p.m. next Monday. We hope you can all attend. Then next Friday, January 16th, City Club presents a State of the Economy program with State Economist Dr. Tom Patowski. He'll present the outlook for Oregon's economy. That'll be here at the Multnomah Athletic Club. And don't forget that you can make reservations online now at www.pdxcityclub.org. On Tuesday, January 20th, City Club extends a warm welcome to new members at an open house reception at the club offices, which will be from 4 to 6 p.m. This is a wonderful chance for everyone, both current and new members, to meet, chat, learn about our opportunities to participate in City Club affairs or activities, and to share some wine and appetizers. The last time we did this, last fall, everybody who went agreed that this is one of the most convivial and pleasant events that the City Club had in recent record. So you'll enjoy it if you can join us on the 20th. And if you're not a City Club member, today's a perfect day to join. During this program, as part of the Keeping Oregon's Promise series, the $25 new member fee is being waived. You can make your payments as a membership monthly and have them withdrawn from your checking account. So see staff here if you're interested in signing up for club membership. Another benefit of being a City Club member is the opportunity to take part in a new book and discussion group called Citizens Read, which gets underway this month with the aptly named book Oregon's Promise by David Peterson Del Mar. Looking Glass Bookstore, was going to have copies available for sale here. I don't think they are, but you can find them at your favorite bookstore. And then on January 26th, we'll have the opportunity to participate in a conversation moderated by the author, Mr. Del Mar himself. That will take place at the Zimmerman Community Center. And you can just check your club bulletin for details. So we encourage all of you to read the book and join our discussions on January 26th. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Pacificor, CH2M Hill, and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We're grateful for their support. So on to our program. Over the last few years, issues relating to financing public services have never been far from the headlines. The recession of the last 3 years has exposed how unstable our public finance system is and renewed the call for reform, with really unresolved and really bitter disputes about the relative emphasis that should be placed on the spending versus the revenue sides of the equation. Next month's referendum on ballot measure 30's tax package is only the most recent dispute over how to address Oregon's challenges in funding public services. Our speakers today, Mike Burton and Kate Brown, represent a range of perspectives and roles in public financing. Senator Kate Brown first moved to the Pacific Northwest to attend the Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark College, and she earned her law degree there as well as a certificate in environmental studies. Professionally, she has practiced family and juvenile law and has taught at PSU. She was elected to represent Senate District 21 in Portland in 1996, following 3 terms as state representative from House District 13. In November 1998, the Democratic caucus elected her as Senate Democratic leader, and she still holds that position. During the last session, she co-chaired the Rules and Legislative Counsel Committees and served on the Legislative Administration, Human Resources Committees, and the Special Committee on the Oregon Health Plan. Our own Mike Burton, and I say that because he's a key member of the City Club Board of Governors, is Vice Provost and Executive Director of Extended Studies at Portland State University. He spent 25 years in various public offices. He served as Executive Director of Metro from 1995 to 2003, but he also served 5 terms in the Oregon House of Representatives, and while at the legislature, sponsored legislation that successfully created a state housing fund, pollution tax credits, sentencing guidelines, and tort and workers' compensation reform. He notes he has also sponsored several attempts to overhaul the state tax system, including a sales tax proposal and a rainy day fund proposal. And Governor Kulongoski just recently appointed Mike Burton to be the be part of the Criminal Justice Commission. And then, as he has for other events, Ethan Seltzer will moderate today's panel. Ethan Seltzer is the director of the School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. Because we're structuring this series as a moderated dialogue, we're going to be taking written comments only from the floor. So if you have questions, if you have a question, please write it down on the cards, which should be at each of your tables, and then raise your hand and a staff person will bring them up to Ethan Seltzer. And please identify yourself by name and that you're a City Club member, and then Ethan will work those into the discussion that goes on today. I think Mike Burton is going to start, and thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and I also appreciate the fact that all of you got out here today. It wasn't the hardest part getting here was getting off light rail and trying to cross the street out here with the slush. But since we're talking about services today, I think we all ought to take a second just to maybe give some applause to the folks who provided the services to us over the last couple of days. The people kept roads going, and our public utilities folks who kept the lines open, and we really appreciate that. And it was a lot of work for those of us who ended up with just simply cabin fever and trying to get out, and we're comfortable in the meantime. Kate and I were just joking a minute ago when Andy introduced me and said that I had sponsored a bill, one of the sponsors of a bill that to create a housing effort for the state. It's one of those things that Kate mentioned. Reads over, says, we've been trying to fund that ever since you created it. That's the way a lot of things sometimes go in this state. We will create legislation, create activities, and then we simply aren't able to deliver the funding that comes for it. Kate and I talked a little bit about last night about how we want to deal with this, because one of the speakers is not able to be here. Max wasn't able to be here, so we're going to cover a couple of things. And I was asked to really kind of do a historical review of services to sort of set the frame for the discussion. And I know that a lot of you are interested in talking about funding, and I think when the two of us get through, we'd be glad to engage in some thoughts about where we think things ought to go in the way of creating funding. But like the housing fund for Oregon that's never had any dollars in it, or very few, we may be looking for a long time for those funds unless we get a real dialogue going with the majority of the people in this state to talk about what we want. Most of you, I'm sure, will undoubtedly recall John Kennedy's famous inaugural speech in 1961, when he stated, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And my question always was, well, why was Kennedy compelled in 1961 to say something like that? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. There's probably a lot of reasons he put that in his speech, but I'm going to speculate that by the 1960s, people needed to be reminded that they were part of the equation of public service, because I think that it probably changed quite a bit. In fact, the whole concept of public services just simply isn't what it used to be. If you go back into history, far back into history, and this is, I'm sorry, the historian to be coming out, but go back to the Egyptians even, and the accepted history of the building of the pyramids is that it was slave labor, that these folks were forced to come in and put time in to build those great, huge edifices that still remain today. But in fact, that's not true at all. The pyramids were really an early example of a massive public works program, and the people who worked on them did so voluntarily and with good cause. What was the cause? It was community service to the greater well-being of the community, And on the way, it would help them achieve something personally, that is eternal life. So it was quite a deal for them. But when you go back and look at the building of those pyramids, that indeed is what it was about. And people came out at a season when their crops weren't growing, and the government indeed of Egypt actually paid people to come in, and they did that as part of their public service. The concept of public service continued on down through the centuries. People contributed their time as public service for the better well-being of the community. There was no exception that these services would simply be there, expectations that the services simply be there. People never really expected that. It was something you had to put your own self into. Each individual was expected to contribute. And there was no expectation that government would provide those services or even organize any of the necessary services. That was pretty much left to local communities or religious groups or benevolent organizations. In the United States, the pattern was also followed. All powers of government stem theoretically from the Constitution. But the Constitution of the United States, indeed the Constitution of Oregon, remember, are limiting documents. They're documents which actually limit the authority and the role of government. The words no and shall not appear quite often in both documents. If you look it through, get on the web sometime and do a scan of the constitutional documents and see how many times the negative terms show up in those two documents. The constitutions were viewed by many, and are still today, as limiting the power of the potential tyranny of government, and are pretty short on the delivery of services to citizens. The Oregon Constitution, its original form, does provide for common schools and a common school fund. But note, it does not provide for the provision of schools. So we need to understand that. What it simply says is that schools shall be common, there shall be a common curriculum, and there shall be common funding, but it doesn't say you have to have schools. So the assumption that that's one of the services of the state is something I think that's created more recently. The original Constitution also provided for militia, a judiciary, and a system of record keeping, filing of deeds, claims. It also allows the state to impose taxes, but places tight restrictions on how it can do so. And I would argue that the collecting of taxes is not a service, but is one way to provide services, and yet the people of this state severely restrict the government's ability to collect and pay for services. So when you begin to look at the Constitution that way, what can government do? It is mostly from a restrictive point of view. The Constitution of Oregon was adopted in 1859. Along the way, there was a Civil War, a progressive movement of the 1890s, a depression, a couple of world wars, and other civil emergencies that changed the general shape of government. To generalize, government at the federal level, and thus at the state level, was viewed and allowed by their citizens to take a larger role in providing services, including regulatory powers, to protect its citizens. One need no look further than the current federal efforts to protect us from terrorism to make my point. It's usually in a crisis period that somehow government is allowed to take on a larger role, providing either regulatory or direct services to the public. So we begin to see two concurrent activities taking place. Federal legislation begins to require states to execute federal legislation. This is what began to happen really at the turn of the last century, as the federal government began to take a look at a larger role in regulating for the safety of folks. This is what, in fact, seems to be debated today about how well the government regulates meat. If you go back to the progressive era and looking at the cleanup that was being attempted in the slaughterhouses, the government began to impose regulatory authorities and required the states to then also take on those regulatory functions as a service to protect citizens. These requirements, some of us call them mandates, come in the form of providing direct federal services or in regulatory requirements such as clean air and clean water regulations. At the same time, states begin initiating their own services. In Oregon, these range from regulation of power in the 1930s to providing loans to veterans and giving tax credits to encourage everything from seismic rehabilitation of buildings to pollution control. But these are not so much direct services as they are means to provide possible services. The fact is that the Constitution of Oregon recognizes a fundamental truth. To provide any kind of service for the common good, it takes some form of capital, either dollars or human capital. And that brings me back to Kennedy's speech. What compelled the president to feel it was necessary to remind people that they should do something for their country rather than feeling that the country should do something for them? I think it's because JFK recognized that we had become the me generation. Do you remember that term from the 60s and the 70s? We were the me generation. We all wanted, coming out of a burgeoning middle class, to have it all. And we forgot about service as part of the equation of public service, and just focused on the service aspect. Services by government became an entitlement, a birthright, not something to be gained, earned, or even cherished. And now we're at the point of demanding these services in a way that we go to the movies. We're looking for instant gratification. We pay for road taxes, so why isn't the road always clear for us? Why is it not that I can drive on the roads anytime I want, anywhere I want, any place I want? After all, I pay a tax for that. But wait, just what does the service the state provide? I think Senator Brown's going to cover that, so I won't go into that area. But I want to really leave just 3 thoughts about this for the moment. Many services today are provided by non-government organizations. There's been a shift in this, and I think one of the things that's often overlooked is what the non-government or the NGOs provide in the way of services to the public. A good example of this is community development corporations. Community development corporations are a public-private effort to provide housing and other types of services to the public, and that seems to be a movement towards that combination of things to provide services today in our public. And if you looked at last Sunday's Oregonian, you saw an article in there about the possible community-based organization taking over the management of forests. So forest practices being taken over again by community-based organizations that will combine federal, state, and local dollars. So the shift here is towards that kind of mechanism. The discussion of services is always hinged on cost. And there may never be an agreement over how much is needed, nor whether the funds should be expended in the first place. There's nothing new in that. There will always be a debate about that, and I think that's part of what we need to do. I think even the Egyptians, the commoners in Egypt, used to argue in front of the Pharaoh about changing the date that they would start working on the pyramid simply because they'd had a delay in the crops coming in. And in fact, that argument about when you should and how you should pay for the services will go on. But finally, I think we need to ask the question about when was the last time we had a good public debate about the delivery of services? I think there has been a tendency in the past to simply wait and look at the cost factor and to consider whether or not we should pay so much for services and how we ought to fund that, rather than whether or not that service is needed in the first place. Are there different ways to provide services than we are currently delivering today? Should we be encouraging more of a public-private combination of efforts, community-based efforts, to really take the concept of delivery of services back into the basic community and asking organizations and people to provide more of those services, a responsibility that we have, I think, as citizens for a common community, rather than just simply waiting for somebody else to deliver those services. What's been lost, I think, is the public service aspect of public service, that service commitment that people ought to have to really say that we're part of a community, and if we want that community to work well, we have to play a role and contribute that. But we need to have that discussion with the public about what are those services we need and how can we best do it. And hopefully this discussion that we're having here today will help further some of that discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I would like to recognize one of my colleagues who's here today, Representative Betsy Johnson. Not only is she one of the smartest legislators, she's also one of the funniest, so I'm really glad she's here today. Thanks. I don't know if you all remember, but I was here about 2 years ago speaking to this very intellectually challenging crowd. And I said a couple of things, and I know I upset former Senator Jane Cease with what I said. But what I did say is that, one, we need to figure out what we want state government to do and how we're going to pay for it. And two, I also said until we build more accountability and credibility in state government spending, we were not going to be successful at raising revenue to balance the budget, or more importantly, reforming our tax system. But then, of course, we happened upon the 2003 legislative session, and we ended up putting a tax package together that would prevent further harmful cuts to essential state services. It was the right thing to do. Yet I still believe, until the people of Oregon believe that their tax dollars are wisely spent, they will continue to be reluctant to pay a little more or rearrange how they pay for state government. But I don't get to talk about ballot measure 30 to you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how your state government currently delivers services and how we're spending your tax dollars more efficiently, and then I'll get back to the progress we're making on the accountability front. When we talk about state services, we're really talking about three basic functions, and everyone in this room knows this, I know, but it bears repeating. As a state, we do three things. We educate, we medicate, and we incarcerate. 91% of the money in the state's general fund is spent on those three basic services. 91%. Over 58% on K-12 community colleges and higher ed, over 21% on human services, primarily healthcare, and 11% on public safety and corrections. It also means that funding for every other state agency or program, whether it's fish and wildlife, agriculture, transportation, LCDC, etc., all come out of the last 9%. So when it comes down to it, especially for education and healthcare, the state does very little except write a check, and sometimes it's a very big check. A huge percentage of state education funding goes to K-12 schools, but the state doesn't technically provide a service. It simply sends money to every local school district. By and large, control is still local, except for the occasional mandate from Salem or Washington, D.C., as in the No Child Left Behind Act. The local school board and the school administrators decide how the funds are spent, how the schools are managed, how our kids are taught, and lately, where the cuts will be made. When I say the state medicates, what I mean is the state foots the bill. The Department of Human Resources oversees a wide range of services for seniors, people with disabilities, and health care for the poor. But only about 3% of those services are directly supplied by Department of Human Resources. When was the last time you saw a state doctor to get a flu shot? You don't. We don't have socialized medicine. The lion's share of services are either supplied by local health care professionals or by county-administered programs, paid for and reimbursed by state tax dollars. However, as a state, we really do incarcerate. Unlike with education and health care, the state actually provides almost all the programs and services under public safety, from hiring state troopers and buying their vehicles to building and operated prisons and youth facilities. But we don't have to do this. We could, if we wanted, make this area of service delivery another bank account only. Some states have gotten out of the corrections business, paying private companies to build prisons. Sometimes they save money. Sometimes they pay the consequences of inadequate training and supervision, and sometimes it costs more. The point I'm trying to make is that by and large, state government rarely provides a service. In fact, only 20% of the general fund is spent on salaries and benefits for state employees. 20%. What we do is parse out tax dollars that are available and set some standards for how they should be spent, leaving the details to local governments, school districts, private providers, county programs, hospitals, and the like. And frankly, this is probably a good thing. We don't need the state legislature acting as the state school board, and we don't need a huge state bureaucracy providing health care and senior services. We need community-level prioritization and community-level involvement in the delivery of services. I believe that's what Oregonians want. But I'm afraid they think what they think of when they hear phrases like delivery of state services is huge bureaucracies, waste, fraud, and abuse. So now I want to get back to the ever unpopular accountability piece. I mentioned earlier that I think we're making progress. The 2003 legislature accomplished far more in terms of making government leaner and more efficient than most any other legislature in history. I'm probably going to get in trouble again with Senator Jane Sees here. When I say that at town hall meetings, the first response I get is, sure you did. Give us some examples. So I do, and I will. And I've got a list as long as your snow shovel, if you actually have one. We cut hundreds of millions of dollars from what the Ways and Means Committee determined were less essential services. These are things like the Capital Planning Commission, Dispute Resolution Commission, Preventative Programs and Corrections, Commissions on Asian Affairs, Black Affairs, and Commission for Women, and the Disabilities Commission. And personally, I wouldn't call any of these last group less essential. PERS, many of you heard about PERS. We did substantial things in terms of reforming PERS, saving over $450 million this biennium, and reducing the PERS long-term unfunded liability from $15 billion to $8 billion. And now with the recent stock market bounce, it's now down to $6.5 billion. In addition to the vacant FTEs, full-time equivalents, we cut during the 2002 special sessions, and you remember there were many of those. We cut over 1,000 vacant positions and laid off 760 employees this session. And if that wasn't enough, we froze compensation for the remaining state-funded workers by eliminating step, merit, and cost of living increases. We refocused the Economic Development Department on job creation and business retention. Marty Brantley and his deputy Jack Isselman are doing a great job in this area and putting Oregon right where we need to be to capitalize on the recovery. And along those same lines, we streamlined regulatory and permitting processes for businesses. We created set-asides for industrial siting and established the top 25 industrial sites ready for development now. This is an area I know the governor spent a great deal of time on, and he's going to continue working on it during the interim. And I expect it will eventually reap big benefits to our economy. So that takes care of the waste, fraud, and abuse budget line. But we also made some important policy decisions that I think are key to the topic today. They make delivery of services more efficient through prudent decisions based on limited resources. Let me give you two examples, and then I'll wrap up. The legislature restructured the Oregon Health Plan, saving $200 million and creating cost responsibility by requiring some recipients share in the cost of their care with co-pays and premiums. Most of us thought at the outset of the session that the Oregon Health Plan was dead, but by working across party lines, we were able to revive it by prioritizing who got services and what type of services they would get. For example, front end versus treatment of last resort. And then while working with private non-profit healthcare providers, we determined that providing healthcare treatment via managed care as opposed to fee-for-service would enable most of the health plan recipients to receive better care. Another issue that we dealt with was in corrections. It's not common knowledge that the fastest growing cost for state correction system is prescription drugs. They use a surprising amount of them for treatment programs and general health care for inmates. That's where we're wishing Representative Williams were here today to talk about some of the things they're doing. Two reforms introduced this year should turn that around. One was Senate Bill 875, sponsored by Bill Morissette, which directs the state agencies to leverage their buying power by purchasing prescription drugs in bulk. There's also another effort being pushed by the governor to collaborate with Washington State and California to buy an even greater bulk, further lowering costs. With the prison population expected to grow by 20% in the next 5 years and drug costs showing no signs of stabilizing, bulk purchasing will save taxpayers substantial amounts of money. If there's a bright side to our state revenue situation, it's that legislators, the governor's office, and all state agencies were prodded to work smarter and operate more efficiently than ever before. We were handed about $3 billion worth of lemons, and I think a lot of good lemonade has come out of it. I've been in this business too long, some people would say far too long, to think that everyone in this room believes what we've done and believes that. I'm sure plenty of Oregonians don't. But if my colleagues and I don't get that message out and do it well, we don't stand a snowball's chance of achieving true tax reform in Oregon for a long, long time. Thanks for listening, and thanks for taking on Mother Nature to be here today. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. Thanks, Mike. I think that helps to kind of frame this issue in a certain kind of sense. Again, on your table are slips of paper. If you have questions, please write them on the slip of paper, hold it up, and a staff member will come around and pick them up and bring them on up to me. I am, again, Ethan Seltzer, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. You know, just to get started, Mike and Kate, you know, one of the things that was interesting, I think, about this last session is just how wide the gulf is in terms of what people regard as appropriate public activities. I mean, for example, we have at least a identifiable number of folks who believe that public shouldn't even own land. and that in the last session, when there was federal money available to buy wetlands, which arguably aren't developable, nonetheless, despite the fact that it wasn't taking anything out of the marketplace, there was still opposition simply to the public owning and holding that land. With that kind of environment, what kind of dialogue about services can we have? And what does that say about kind of where we are?
Let me take it.
Sure.
Well, I think it's still important for us to figure out what it is we want state government to do. And as I noted ad nauseum, we educate, we medicate, and we incarcerate. And what was interesting to me when Kevin Mannix came out with his way of rebalancing the budget is that he didn't want to not provide any of those key services. He just wanted our children to pay for it. So, you know, I guess what I'm hearing is that there's general consensus around us at least paying for those three major services.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think the debate is, I mentioned, around what should government be providing and versus what is it that the public should be willing to contribute. And what we've really done is we've moved away from direct involvement in public services to wanting to buy it. And if we want to buy it, then we have to recognize that we have to come up with some way to fund that. We used to have a draft. It wasn't universal because women were excluded, but we had an expectation that you would have some public service. Now we buy the best armies and navies in the world that we can get, and we have to pay for that. And it actually ends up costing us more, if you look at the range of the cost of services in that sense, to actually have a professional paid-for military, particularly when it's backed up by a reserve and National Guard function, because you're taking people out of their place of work for periods of time that disrupts the workplace. So there's a huge cost to that. But what is it that the first question you have to ask is, what do we expect the role of that military to be? How much of a world policeman should the United States be in its role as we stretch out? The public simply seems to want us to be everywhere doing everything, and there's going to be a huge cost to that. We don't seem to be engaged in a debate about whether or not we ought to be engaged in those activities in the first place. And we don't, not even at the national level. So I think if you expect, when you get down to the state level, again, I think that debate is going to go on forever as to what exactly should it be that the public wants to have and what it expects the government to provide.
Well, Mike, I think that, you know, the point about service is a good one, although I don't think you're saying that there shouldn't be things that are in fact provided collectively.
No, not at all. In fact, I think if you look at it, I don't think anybody would talk about privatizing the judiciary, for example. I'm
not talking about privatization. I'm talking about the fact that, okay, we've learned from community policing, for example, that you can't have a safe community if you just expect the police to provide safety. That safety comes from people knowing their neighbors, from knowing what's going on in the neighborhood, from knowing what's going on the street, that there's kind of a collective production of public safety that really makes a neighborhood safe. It doesn't just come from delegating it to an agency, but that agency is extremely important. I mean, you're not arguing that it's just all about service, right?
No, not at all. I think the question, though, is that if you have, and it's a good example, the police, if you have community police forces, and you're absolutely right, public safety is much more than just a police department. But the police department has to be there to be a fundamental level of service, and the question is how much are people willing to contribute to that. We probably, however, I would guess, would be able to reduce the cost of police forces if more people took responsibility for assisting in the safety of their own neighborhoods. And we moved away from that, I think, to some extent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The public generally began to become disassociated with their own neighborhoods, their own communities, their own sense of involvement in the community, and expected those services simply to be delivered. And that's the problem, is I think we have to get back to the point that you simply can't buy public safety. You can't buy that sort of thing simply with a dollar amount. You actually have to be involved in it yourself.
Well, maybe this is for both of you then. Are we thinking about public services in the wrong terms? I mean, really, Mike, what you're describing to me is citizenship.
Yes.
It's not about public safety. It's about citizenship. What does it mean to be part of a community? You know, what does it mean to be a citizen? You know, if you expect someone else to pick up that wrapper that's flowing down the street, if you expect someone else to know whether, you know, the elderly neighbor next door is warm and has food during this ice storm, you know, in fact, you know, will in fact those things happen, or in fact, are those in fact things that we need to expect more of out of citizenship? You know, what do citizens do?
I guess, Ethan, that's kind of the conversation that we had at the beginning, at the outset of the 2003 session. And we came in for the first time in history facing not only a deficit for the incoming session 03-05, but we had to deal with a deficit for 01-03. And because of the short time frame, we couldn't raise taxes, fees, and et cetera to fill the void. We ended up borrowing money to cover that deficit. But what we had during that conversation was what were some of the basic services, a safety net, so to speak, that government should provide that we would borrow and pay for. And some of those services ended up being like programs for the medically needy. It was a narrowed down program, but we have a number of people in our communities. I had a number of people in my neighborhoods that came down to see me that frankly would die if they lost their medication because the medically needy program was going to be cut. And so I think the other piece of the conversation has to be, you know, what basic level of safety net are we as a society going to decide? And I was willing to borrow to make sure that those people wouldn't die. That's not a decision that I took lightly, but I just couldn't bear to see that.
Well, you know, I guess one of the questions that occurs to me, Kate, when you talk about it that way, is we talk increasingly about, you know, who gets the services, and frankly, for many citizens, they don't directly, in their minds, maybe receive services. I mean, we talked a little bit before we started this afternoon about how counties, for example, serve actually directly a relatively small percentage of county residents, because counties are kind of the social and criminal justice kind of safety net that essentially serves folks who are least able to serve themselves, whereas most people probably don't directly receive county criminal justice services or health services. I mean, hopefully. We know that
20% more, though.
Right. In fact, in some ways, you know, we're hoping that we are developing a community where nobody will need county services. But in fact, many people do, but a relatively small proportion of the total population.
And that's very different county-wide. I'm most familiar with Multnomah County because that's what I've represented over the last several years, but as a result of redistricting, I picked up the city of Milwaukie and Clackamas County. And so Clackamas County, for example, is a direct service provider, and that's very different than Multnomah County. So it does, the other aspect of that, it's very different county to county, and I believe Washington is a mix of the both. So each county is different in terms of how they actually provide the services.
Mm-hmm. You know, we've got a lot of questions here about accountability, you know, and this kind of notion of accountability. But is that the place to start? I mean, is it really a question of how do we, you know, kind of demonstrate that every dollar is spent to every person's satisfaction, or is there something missing here? Is there something having to do with essentially what kind of society we want to live in that's kind of not holding us together maybe the way it used to?
Well, yeah, I think things are changing in our society. One of the things that, you know, I don't know if anybody's been on eBay before, but my first time I went on eBay, I wanted to buy something, and I figured out how to do it, and I went on, and somebody said, make sure you bid in the last minute, because otherwise people outbid you. And so I went on, and I placed my bid, and then I sat there thinking, and it said I had the high bid, and I thought, gee, I've won this. And I sat there, and for a couple of seconds, and I realized, wait a minute, this thing, the clock isn't moving. And what I had to do was hit the refresh button, because what's there is static, if you don't know this. And so I hit the refresh button and found out that in the last 3 seconds, somebody had indeed outbid me, and I lost it. And I think that's what we have to do today. We have to remember to hit the refresh button, because things change a lot, and time moves on.
I was wondering where this was going.
and we sometimes
Society, eBay.
Well, in
there's
fact,
no justice in eBay. Is that what you're saying here?
there's no justice in eBay. And in fact, though, I think that's what's happening. I think the way that people are viewing things today is different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. We use, for instance, I'm reading about this new program. You can set aside a tax-free health plan, and that corporations are going to probably start providing some match to that, like a 401k for health plans, doing away with guaranteed pension plans and going to 401ks. This is what the state did with PERS. They moved towards essentially modernizing, if you would, that. We've become an investment-oriented society. We want to know exactly where our money is going, what exactly we can get back for it, and looking for those specific benefits. Those kinds of things, I think, lead us to wanting and demanding very specific information and accountability for every dollar that goes out. And that's what happens with tax dollars. We used to say, even when I was in the legislature, which was not that long ago, The general thing was the general fund was left up to the legislature to decide where to spend that money. And tax measures would go out, and there would be general tax measures, and people would expect elected officials to make those decisions later on. Now you can't put a ballot measure out without saying specifically what those dollars are going to be used for. And it's a different way of looking at if you would, the Republican form of government with a small r here, than it was. There's an expectation that everything has to be absolutely accountable for. You have to account for everything. The fact is that I think the public generally isn't that well informed about what accountability there is in the system. And I think there's a much more accountability than we probably are willing to admit sometimes. I think that a lot of public employees put in tremendous amounts of effort and work. Nobody's out there trying to cheat the system. And the fact is that they really are returning a lot for the dollars that are invested. If you look at the ratio of tax dollars that you're spending for the kind of services you're getting back, there's a pretty good return on investment there. The fact is, though, I think you're right, is that the public, a lot of those costs are going into provide a basic level of services a lot of us don't use. But it does basically hold up the fundamental aspect of our society and our commitment to the elderly and people who are in need like that. A lot of those costs go there, and it also is our public safety. How many people do we want to lock up? Do we want to continue to have a 20% growth in population of our prison system, or would we rather invest that in education so they don't get there in the first place? So those are the questions we need to ask ourselves, and that's where the accountability ought to be. Accountability ought to be measured in terms of how well and how many students are we graduating from high schools and college, rather than how many people are we incarcerating in our jail system.
Well, go ahead, Kate.
I think that's very well said, and I think we have to thank former Governor Barbara Roberts and Beverly Stein for implementing the Oregon benchmarks, because I think that was really the true onset of performance-based budgeting and holding state agencies accountable. And I do think you can take the accountability, credibility piece too far, and I do think that there is a certain aspect of the population, I don't know what the percentage are, Ethan, you may know better than I, 20-30% of the population that is always going to think government is the agency of waste, abuse, and fraud. But that is why your 2003 legislature moved forward with a committee to take a look at Oregon's tax system, because Kurt Schrader, conservative Democrat from Canby, I don't know that Randy Miller, Republican from Lake Oswego, supported that move, but he felt like they had done everything they could these last 2 years to continue to build accountability in state government, and it was time for us to take a look at the tax system and figure out how we can stabilize or restructure our tax system. So I think that's why your legislature, myself included, supported moving forward and creating a committee to do that work. We'll see what they can accomplish.
Well, let me ask you both this, though. Are we barking up the wrong tree when we try to establish accountability for public service the same way we do for, private goods, or for, as you put it, Mike, investments? I mean, in essence, we're kind of promising people a kind of accountability that might work real well with respect to the profit and loss of a corporation or a share of stock. But, how does it work well with, for example, kids in hunger? How do we kind of, do we have the right metaphor here? I mean, another way of looking at it is, you can go to Rich's cigar store and you can buy a magazine on purple Volkswagen microbuses. And if you don't want to read about the green ones or the orange ones, it's okay because they have their own magazines. Well, is that the kind of public service menu we're trying to present to people, and accountability? Or, in fact, do we need a kind of a new metaphor here? Or maybe harking back to the ancient Egyptians, Mike, if we're going to have a dialogue, do we need to start talking about eternal life?
Measuring that would be difficult. I'm always, I think some of the things are more visible in government services than others, and I'm always reminded when I was at Metro, we had a lot to do with transportation systems, and we would get complaints often from people, even though we weren't the service delivery mechanism for that. It was most of them were state or local roads. People would complain about, well, I saw those guys standing around the shovel. I used to think that was a myth, but we surveyed people and said, oh, no. This is true. Those people out there wasting my tax dollars because they're all standing around. 3 of them are standing around somebody else in the shovel. I always had to go back and remind people those are contractors. Those are private sector folks. The state, about most of the road construction of these things, is not provided directly by government. It's private organizations doing that. So who's holding them accountable? The state should hold those contractors accountable if indeed that's a problem. So a lot of times it's an oversight question on the part of that. The other thing, Kate mentioned this, is the amount of these dollars that come down to help delivery of services to people in need, and you know, the child welfare programs and people who are needy of those are federal dollars coming down with a whole raft of federal regulations on how you do that. And so you end up having to create local bureaucracy in order to oversee how that's done. And it's difficult to measure that actual accountability. But I think having benchmarks of seeing how many people are we able to move off of those systems, how many people do you avoid putting into a higher level of medical care than you would if you were not providing a basic service level. It costs, the higher up, the more that you don't treat people at basic services for medical costs, the cost goes up. So we need to look at that way and take it. It's not as easy as saying we paved 1.3 miles of road to measure how well have we succeeded in providing an education for a child who otherwise wouldn't get it. That is difficult to do, but I think we have to find a good metaphor for it. You're right.
And I would just respond, I don't know if you can get to where you're going if you don't have clear goals about where it is you want to get to. And using the Oregon benchmarks again, and this is a really old example, so don't quote me on it, but late 90s we had a measurement for teen pregnancy. I want to say 10 out of 1,000 girls, 17 to 13, that we wanted to get the teen pregnancy rate down to 10 per 1,000, and I think the rate we had was 17. I know that Tillamook, for a fact, actually got their rate down so that we knew that the dollars we were spending there were helpful. And if they weren't, we could have moved those dollars elsewhere, a different program, tried something new. So I think we need to measure.
Well, you know, okay, let's push on this measurement business a little bit here, because I mean I think everybody's being asked to measure this, measure that, but the fact of the matter is, I mean I think our kids are being expected to kind of measure their progress on an hourly basis in school. I'm not sure it's such a good thing. You know, if this benchmarking notion was so powerful, then how come the legislature doesn't use it so directly? Or let me ask you a slightly different way. The more we kind of descend into measurement as our means for communicating accountability, are we in fact losing the public? Is this more about kind of inside baseball and less about helping to get the word out there in a way that enables people to relate to what's happening to their community, their society? You know, what's enabling us to kind of actually promote more comprehensive citizenship rather than just simply, you know, kind of reacting to the latest news and numbers from Salem? I mean, you know, help me out here, because you guys have great faith in the benchmarking, but I'm thinking, okay, I like measurement and data as much as the next person, maybe more. Yeah. But what I'm wondering is, you know, how do we communicate with the public? How do we kind of, you know, get this out there? What are we really trying to address when we do that?
I think part of what you have to do is put that in terms of investment. If indeed those are public dollars going to those programs, showing the consequences of not doing those actions might be more important than showing the consequences of doing those actions. If indeed you can demonstrate that.
Can you do that though?
I think you can.
Life is lived in real time. You know, you can't go back and kind of run the experiment again. You lose a generation.
Well, and that's why in developing those policies and putting together those programs, you better make sure you got good people doing it in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that in this society we leave up to the legislature to start out with, or the Congress. And indeed, that again goes back to public responsibility for making certain that we are engaged in the questions, understand what we're asking to happen. That again comes to what's individual expectations and goals for what government services ought to be. And if we're not able to articulate that ourselves, then we can't expect our public policymakers to articulate that as well.
And I think we should also know, Ethan, we had a fairly comprehensive program in our corrections systems during the 90s of drug and alcohol treatment, sex abuse treatment, and basic GED education. Most, if not all, those I don't know what level of those programs, but those programs have been cut back substantially as a result of our budget cuts. It will be very interesting to compare recidivism rates, repeat offender rates, from the population that did not get treatment or college or whatever in prison versus those populations from 96 to 2000 that did get those types of treatments. And I think that's a wonderful thing to invite Max Williams back to talk about in a couple of years after we have the stats.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't want to, kind of leave this too soon. And the reason is that it seems to me that ultimately there's a question of trust here, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that each of us can't be directly involved in providing all the public services we care about every day because we've got jobs, right? We got other things to do. We got kids to play with. We got, parents to talk to. We've got neighbors to socialize with. So we're all not, going to be able to kind of be directly involved in kind of measuring and managing public services on a daily basis. That means we've got to trust people to do it. So I'm not convinced that kind of benchmarks and measurement are going to restore the trust, nor I think are some of the questioners here. So, where do we start? There's been a lot of chatter about, well, we need to have a dialogue. Well, what kind of dialogue, though? Again, let's go back to eternal life, Mike. I kind of like that. Do we need to, kind of refocus the terms of this debate? Are we kind of moving down the wrong road here?
Well, I think to me, we are moving down the wrong road because we've become disassociated from our civic process and civic engagement. I think that's something that's talked about amongst a number of us. And how do you re-engage that civic discussion? The City Club is a place that tries to do that, and yet we struggle as a club often to get the people outside of the group here to get engaged in those discussions. I think it's a long process. I don't think it happens instantaneously. The other day, there was going to be a discussion about tax reform, and somebody asked me if I was going to go, and I said, no, I'm tired of doing that. I will go when somebody actually stands up and says, here's what I think we ought to do, and I can follow them and say, okay, I'll go for that. I've voted for tax reforms and sales taxes in my life. I put my neck out, and by the way, it doesn't work. Well, why didn't that happen? I think it's because I didn't really engage the rest of the public in that discussion with me to the point that everybody began to understand what happens. And I think that's something that doesn't happen immediately. Everybody wants instant gratification. Show me the plan, bang. If it's good, I'll vote it up or down. But in fact, I think it's going to take a prolonged effort that goes through, and I think there's people who would be willing to do that over a period of time that will actually begin to reformulate the role that the public has to play in making those decisions. Again, I think we've sort of left the general public has left the question up to somebody else to resolve, and they'll just simply go to the polls when it comes time to vote up or down without really being engaged in the process. So somehow, I think those of us who care about this have to spend more time trying to engage people who don't care about it so that they do care.
Kate?
I think it's the answers are multiple and multi-layer. I think term limits that passed in 1992 and has since been reversed by the courts, but my understanding is there are now signature gatherers out gathering signatures for term limits is a really good example of the lack of trust in both state and federal government. It happened to impact your state legislature. But the interesting thing is that if you ask most people on the street, would they vote for their own legislator again, they would all say yes. But a good portion, I don't remember the percentage was, voted in support of term limits because they wanted to clean house and get rid of those folks that they didn't trust. So there is a dichotomy there that's happening. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of help build the citizenship aspects. And a really good example I think that's happening is Portland Schools Foundation is having legislators, business folks be principals and teachers for a day on February 5th. I think I'm going to be a principal for a day. I can't imagine that they would want me to do this, but it sounds like great fun, so I'm going to take the opportunity. But I think each and every one here should call the Schools Foundation and ask them to participate to really see what's going on in our schools. I have a stepchild, ADD, and he's in public schools, and I can't imagine having a class of 30 kids like him in school. It would be really tough. And so our teachers are doing really amazing things. Our principals are doing really amazing things. And I think only 20%, 17% of people in Oregon have kids in schools. I think more of us need to get back into the schools and see what we're doing and see what's working and what's not. And I think that same analogy could be same kinds of programs could be used. Who wants to go work with ODOT for a day and be out on I-84 blocking mad truckers from going to Hood River? I mean, I don't want to be doing that. I mean, there's a whole lot of...
We got a volunteer in the back there, Kate.
So anyway, I just think it would be really interesting to do some job trading over the next year and see what people learn from it. I'm able to do that as a state senator. I can get small groups of people into prisons. We can do some interesting things. I don't know how we do it on a mass level.
Well,
I think one of the things, just to be a little bit Eeyorish about it, what I worry about is when you look back historically is that in this country it has taken some kind of a crisis before there's a movement towards change. The kind of delivery of federal services that we get right now came out of the Depression, which was a major national crisis, and people were willing to let the government take extraordinary steps to correct that. 9/11's another one of those. It seems to be changing the face of us. We're all afraid. And so in the face of that fear, we're willing to let government take steps that we probably wouldn't ordinarily let occur happen. It goes through like that, and what I hope we don't get to in Oregon is that we face some crisis. When I was in the legislature, I tell you, we never had any money when I was in the legislature, but we always had some place to go. This last legislature did not have any place to go. This would have been a terrible session to be in because you had absolutely no flexibility on where you could go. And as Kate mentioned, they actually had to borrow just in order to keep some things going. And that's unusual. Okay, if we're at that point now and things don't turn around within the next session, will there be a crisis that allows perhaps positively or negative for government to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise happen? It'll take the public to change the funding mechanism for services if that's what's desired. But usually the public isn't going to act until there's some sort of crisis for that. And you can go back again and take a look at all the attempts that have been made to reform taxes in the state over a period of time. Never happened when there was a crisis going on. It usually happened when there was some perception there and the public simply didn't share in that perception. So hopefully we don't simply act on crisis, but we can act when there's an opportunity to do things rationally and with some good policy sense to it.
Well, there's nothing like a good ice storm to erase the lines between red and blue America, and it's worked pretty effectively over the last couple of days here in Portland. But I think Mike actually, just to kind of correct the record a little bit, actually we don't have to wait for the public. We elect people to take those risks, to basically get out in front, to put those proposals there. And so, no, I'm not waiting for the citizens to kind of come up with some ideas. I'm actually kind of waiting for elected officials in some ways to take some
And that's why we have our tax reform committee, and look forward to seeing you testify in front of it.
Well, we're looking forward to it. Now, let me ask you both one last question. One of the things that's kind of implicit in some of these questions is that, time after time, the river starts to rise, and, we get out the sandbags and we save whatever it is. And it looks like there's actually no problem at all. We're getting kind of pretty adept. Public employees, public leaders, in fact, in my experience, are pretty adept at trying to figure out a way to solve the problem and make it appear as if there was no problem at all. Are we, in fact, too good at providing public services? Are we becoming too adept at essentially dodging bullets? Is this kind of like, one of those Matrix movies or something, where the legislature is down there kind of stopping them as they come at them, and it's time to let a few of them through?
I think what happens with ballot measure 30 will be a true test of how adept we are. Of the roughly $750 million revenue package, we've disappropriated automatically about $545 million. So there's about a 238 million squish hole that we're going to have to cover.
That's still a lot of money.
That's still a lot of money. But there's some things happening. The revenue forecast was up. We're waiting to hear what the March revenue forecast is. The agencies are going through a rebalancing and a reversion process, and we anticipate there will be some more money there. So we may be able to cover that hole without making any further cuts. The big discussion is, what do we do with the $545 million disappropriation? And my sense is that, well, I will tell you where I'm at. I want to let the cuts stand. I think we did the best job that we could, given who was in the legislature. We put together a package that was progressive, fair, and based on ability to pay. And we made cuts that are proportionately reflected in those that got the revenue increases. So I would be extremely hard pressed to revise those cuts.
And I think I just go back a minute ago to what you said, Ethan, about you want the leaders to lead. I think indeed the last legislative session is an example of where I think there was a lot of leadership. The legislature in a very tight situation with limited revenues actually made some decisions. Now though, the public has to decide whether or not we want them to lead. And if we don't want them to lead, then I guess we'll vote no on 30 and tell them, okay, we didn't like what you want, and then there'll be a greater expectation to somehow fix that. So your whole business about fixing things is true. And I think if I were in the legislature, if ballot measure 30 were to fail, my tendency would say, okay, we did the best we could, and we have to now live with this. That's what the public has said to us. That may precipitate a little bit of that crisis. My concern is that those cuts that will have to occur will be done in a way that the general public won't get it again. That somehow it'll be the other guy down the street that had that problem, or somebody who's not related that'll have had that problem, and you'll grouse a little bit about the school cost loss potentially that are there, but that's already been happening. So I think we'll miss the point again. That's what I'm worried about. We may very well, even in spite of the situation, if ballot measure 30 goes down, or I guess 30 passes, I don't know how that is anyway, if the legislature loses that 500 and some odd $1 million, that somehow, even if those stand, that we will miss the point. And I think that if you look, we'll have to look down underneath that and see what was really happening. But we did elect those people to make those decisions. They went down there. They made some tough decisions. They made it collectively. I think they did a good job of it. Now, whether or not we're going to let them lead is up to us. And that's one of the problems is we do elect people to lead, and then we say, oh, and by the way, but only the way I want you to
Maybe
lead.
not so much,
And
right.
Not so much.
So for those of you who are watching, this really is about what kind of state you want to live in, what kind of citizen you want to be, what kind of society you want to be a part of, what kind of future you want, both for yourself and for your kids. And so with that, I want to thank Mike and Kate for being here with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank the audience for all of their questions. Thank you very much.
And the City Club is adjourned. We'll turn you back out into the cold and the ice. So.
Drive carefully, everybody,
Walk
or take the
carefully.
bus.